Hello and welcome to my poster session on Western civilization and slavery. This is for Professor Mahaffey's class. I'm Marina Collier, and I will be examining whether or not Western civilization and slavery are intrinsically connected. So let's start with the introduction here. Now, my introduction is there a connection between Western civilization and slavery? Well, we are all well aware of the horrors of slavery that existed in America for centuries, but the modern assumption is that slavery is no longer a part of our world, our modern world, ignoring the realities of it that we all profit from. Now, this research will show the ways that Western civilization was not only founded on slavery, but has never truly been without it, and in fact thrives by it. America's society slept in the profits of slave labor while parading itself as a prominent supporter of liberty. Now, I know I sound kind of anti-Western civilization by saying this, or anti-American, or anti-whatever you want to call me. I am simply trying to point out the things that we tend to ignore, that we all kind of live in this nice little bubble of ignorance that I like to pop, because yes, ignorance is bliss, but that blissfulness will come to an extreme halt once it collapses. You can only live in ignorance for so long, and that's my strong belief. So by addressing this and seeing these connections, if we truly want to be supporters of liberty and justice throughout the world, as America claims to be, we need to recognize the ways that the civilization that we have is very much dependent on slavery. So that was basically my aim there that I was saying. You can see that here. Also, I want to point out here, I have a little map of the African slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, that went on for roughly 200 years. Now, my literary review here, this is going to be talking about all my different kinds of literature that I used for my essay and for this poster. My first topic here is my literary examples concerning liberty. Now, these were all pulled from our textbook for this course, the Norton Anthology of English Literature. I looked at the works of Mary Estelle and John Locke, Olaudah Equiano, and Samuel Johnson. Now, all four of these authors are listed in the book as part of the liberty section. So basically, I took the liberty section of the textbook and examined that in comparison with the rest of the things that I was looking at when talking about liberty. And liberty, in fact, as you can see in the works, as you can see now, is just truly a contradiction in itself. You know, independence from outside thought, you have to have some kind of restrictions. If you have a civilization, you have to have, as Samuel Johnson, John Locke looked at when he was talking about the two treaties of government, there has to be some kind of restrictions on society in order for society to function. So you have to give up certain liberties, because otherwise you would have the liberty to kill and maul and steal and do whatever you'd like because you're free to do so. You know, free will actually has to have constraints in order for it to truly be functional in society. But too much restraints, that will drive any person insane. Because, I mean, if you have your own free thought, you want to have free will. You know, your own ideas to be implemented at whatever time you wish. But there has to be restrictions as to how it affects other people. So that's what John Locke really addressed here in his part. Mary Estelle was also talking about how it applies to marriage and womanhood, and how, you know, women want to be just as free as any man, and comparing it to the kind of restrictions that are placed by the king. But I love it. I love parts of it. I don't love all of it, but I love the fact that she addressed the king as being so being given this amount of power freely by the men under which they're under which he's ruling, but women don't really have as much authority in that. You know, when they come under their husband, as she put it, they lose all of their freedom, they lose all of their liberty, all of their right to choose, and that's even worse, because technically you're supposed to be doing this under free will as well. So those comparisons were very interesting to me as well when talking about liberty and what that means. But, and then of course, Olaudah Equiano, he was a slave, but he turned a free man, and his biography was extremely important in this. Sorry, I'm shaking this screen really quick, but his biography was very important in examining what it means to be free when concerning blacks, when concerning Africans, because there was this prevalent idea of these are lesser men that we are elevating, but in reality, these are just men that live differently, and so you thought of them as lesser, and even they can adapt to British society, to our upstanding culture. So why are we still treating them as less? Why are we still treating them as animals? And Samuel Johnson basically had that same idea when he was addressing the what's it called? When he was addressing the court in favor of freeing a slave who was stolen as a child from Jamaica. Now, I'm going to move on to the examples of slavery and dependency on slavery. When looking at Bradley and Morford's works, both of them are talking about the Greco-Roman world. And one thing that I have always been obsessed with throughout my life is Greek and Roman mythology. I think it's so fascinating how extremely human their gods are. But another part of that is the society that was so connected to it. And that I haven't always enjoyed, because of the fact that their society truly was very it was very, very intellectually advanced. And we acknowledge that, oh wow, the Greeks, they had all these great thinkers, they had all these great knowers and doers, and we admire that, but we ignore the fact that the only reason why these people had the free time to do and know and learn all these things was because they had slaves doing a lot of the heavy work that any normal person would have to do. And so they had elevated themselves to a certain point in society where they could use free thinking and free knowledge and not have to deal with the menial tasks of day to day, because they had somebody else to do it. But this was all slave work imported from other parts of the world, especially during the Roman Empire. And, you know, you have this idea of the outsider being a brute, this barbaric outsider that we have come and taken them into our society, in a lowly part of our society, in order to help them by elevating them to slave. So this idea that I just talked about in the works from the 1800s, that can be seen way back in the Greco-Roman world. And then looking at Kirsten Olson's book, which she addresses the 18th century Europe, she talks about the way that it's basically still feudalistic. You know, we talk about feudalism as being a product of the medieval world, the medieval times, which, of course, in this course we talked about earlier in the semester. But this feudalistic idea is still prevalent in European society. And then if you really look at it, that same idea still can be seen today. But I'll talk about that a little more in the next section. But her works were really examining how different life was for the ones at the top. Like, there was a handful of people who really were considered nobles, noblemen, noble families. And the rest of the world was living off of, I'm pretty sure the numbers were about 100 a year whereas the top class were at $800 a year in reference to income. So like 8 times the amount of money was going to a handful of people rather than the lower class. I need to double check that, but it can be seen in Kirsten Olsen's book. What was the title of that? That was The Daily Life in the Ancient Century England. So it actually focused more on England, but she did talk about other parts of Europe. That's why I said Europe. But yeah, let's go back here. So these other books that I used talking about slavery and dependence on slavery were Herbert Klein's, Marcus Rediker, and Hugh Thomas. They all talked about the Atlantic slave trade. But they also addressed how important it was to society. So the trail was, which I feel like it needs to be addressed because we're talking about how important it is. The trail was that England was supporting the slave trade by giving guns and ammunition, making it in England and sending it to Africa. Now in Africa, of course, there were slave traders there, but then the African community, the African peoples themselves were a big player in it, because these guns were given to them as a trade-off. Now, this sparked wars between the Africans. There was different communities, especially West Africa was very heavily affected by this. There was, like, Nigeria. There were a lot of people fighting different neighboring tribes, neighboring countries, because it was easy to do so with the guns. The guns were given to them by the British, and in exchange for guns, they wanted people. So, if I want to protect my people, I will steal people from another community that I don't like, and give them to these people so I can have protection with guns, so that nobody else steals my people. So it was a slew of wars. It's what would you do? Do you deny the guns and then you have no protection for your people and then your people get carted off? Or do you take the guns as protection for yourself and then use the guns to get other people in different areas to give to these white men who are threatening to take them anyway? There's a really, really hard... It's a really hard thing to fight when it's either kill or be killed in that situation. But that was what it was when it came to the African part of the slave trade. And then, of course, these slaves were sent over to the Americas, North and South, and especially the Caribbean. And these slaves were sent there, and they were used for working. Working in the fields, working for sugar, working for cotton, tobacco, all of that. I mean, of course, this part is very familiar to us as Americans because that was our part of the Atlantic slave trade that we held on to for so long. And then, of course, all of that sugar, tobacco, cotton, and gold, other riches, were sent back to England. So it was a cycle of guns to Africa, people from Africa to the Americas, and all these goods, cotton, gold, and everything sent back to England. And so it was a triangle. They kept on. It was a cycle that never stopped because England was profiting. Why wouldn't you profit? You're getting tons of stuff just for sending out guns. The guns are giving your people work. You have factories set up for guns. That helps you a lot. So it doesn't really help when you're trying to stop something like this, because now you're asking for people to shut down factories, trying to shut down all the sugars and cottons and things that they're getting from the Americas, which is helping their economy. So the economy was too heavily tied into this mass incarceration, this mass slavery of these people. But when you look at the humanity of it, it's horrifying. But when you look at the political part of it, the economical part of it, it makes sense why it lasts so long. Is because it was so vital to everybody else's livelihood. What does it hurt me that a barbarian is being sent to another part of the world when I get to have all the stuff that I need and I have a job? It's really hard to break things like that, and that's why it was so hard to stop it. But eventually it was stopped, thankfully, because otherwise I wouldn't exist. But it's really disheartening to see that this is how the world functioned for so long. But now we have a new kind of slavery and dependency on slavery after the 18th century, after the abolition in both Europe and in the Americas. Now you have things like Michelle Alexander's novel, which I think everyone should read, called The New Jim Crow. That addresses how in the Americas, in America especially, it's this system of mass incarceration in order to keep people in the undercast, is what she calls it. It's the 13th Amendment, the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery did not abolish slavery in prisons. So technically, as a prisoner, you are a slave. Technically. Well, the problem is less about being sent to the prisons and more about the fact that now you are branded felon when it comes to drug charges. Having marijuana on you with an intent to sell, automatic 5 years, and you're listed a felon. As a felon, how do you get a job? How do you secure income? How do you get housing? How do you do anything to support yourself when you have this on your record? Something that's so minimal, and that drug use is so widespread throughout every race. It's being so concentrated on the Black and Hispanic communities because they're the ones being stopped the most and searched the most for this. You know, if you know that there's an equal amount of chance that, let's say, 10 people in a room, all of different races, if there's an equal amount of chance that all of them had drugs, but you're only consistently searching the Blacks and the Hispanics, doesn't it make more sense to see that they're going to be sent to jail more? She goes into way more depth than I can get into right now, but that's like the bigger part of it. Then I looked at Deneen Brown's article about the attack on Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma. That is something I feel like we should be learning in high school, yet I had never heard until after I was in college. It was this entire community of Blacks who were thriving, yet because of racial hate, I mean, it was a hate act, it was burned down. And all of these profits, this thriving community of Blacks was burnt down. And we haven't seen much something like that since then, because directly afterwards there was also a bigger push for Jim Crow laws, which prevented Blacks from getting the resources that they needed to do things like this. And then, of course, you're looking at mindsets that have been passed down through generations that Blacks can't amount to anything because we're being pushed down too much. And the list goes on and on and on. That's a different rabbit hole I will not jump down. But overall, that is a part of the slavery that still goes on in America through mass incarceration that I can't fully dive into as much as I want because I'm already taking too much time on this. But the clearer form of actual slavery that's going on is presented here in Jordan Amon's article. Now he talks about what was the actual country? I don't want to misspeak. Where is he? Amon. Okay, I can't get an actual article here. Actual country here. I know it's in Eastern Europe. I am so sorry I cannot speak the actual article, the actual country, but Jordan Amon looked at how in Eastern Europe there are workers that are working for close to nothing to make textiles for us in America. Now, we as Americans joke about cheap labor. We joke about China having sweatshops. We joke about things that it shouldn't be funny, because these are people who are essentially being held into slavery. You're trying so desperately to work for a living, but you're barely making anything, while people on the other side of the world can buy that clothing that you just made for about $2, about $10. It doesn't make any sense, because the profits are going straight to the people who are forcing them to work in such conditions. Again, they're still being paid, yes, but if you're not making enough money in order to feed yourself or your household, are you actually surviving? If you can't actually feed yourself, even though you've been working all day, is that laziness? Like so many people like to say that poor people are just lazy. Or if you're working to the bone and you still don't have enough money, whose fault is that actually? Is that theirs for not knowing any better and taking the jobs that were available? Or is it the people who should be paying them what they're worth? Or is it the people who are profiting from it? But as I said in my paper, this is done on a $500 laptop and done by somebody who has running water and electricity in her home. So maybe I shouldn't be talking. Maybe I should be looking closer at myself. But let me go ahead and look at the results here. The implications of this research is that Western society does need slavery to survive. And it's so ironic, because we really champion ourselves as people of liberty, people of justice around the world. We are the ones who will help those in need, and we have such a soft spot for those who are hurting, any natural disasters, any kind of crisis. Americans are so big to jump in, and we are considered the pinnacle of Western society. But how great are we when we are still profiting from the hardships of others? Does that make us great? Does that make us actual champions of liberty? We are the 1% to 2%. We are the ones on top of the pyramid when it comes to feudalism. We may not be the kings as the general population, but we are very close. So in a lot of ways, we can be considered the lords, the vassals to the king. There's no clear-cut way of addressing this without sounding like I hate our economy, I hate our civilization, which I don't. I think Western civilization has made great achievements in helping mankind as a whole and helping people to do better. I mean, there's just so much good that has come from all these advancements, all of these achievements that our civilization has conquered. So I am not anti-American at all. I love my country. I've never been outside of it, so I can't really say much about the rest of the world either. I want to experience it, but I do think that there are some things that are inherently wrong when we're saying that we are such champions of liberty, yet at the same time we're profiting from taking somebody else's liberty. So my conclusion here is that the research also points to the problems within the African American population and the ways that slavery still has resounding impacts on them. I say them, even though I am technically half Black. I'm a part of it as much as I'm not a part of it, weirdly enough, because of my mixed background. But it's really, really sad to see how hard and how what's the word? how reluctant people are to address that these things are still going on today, that there's still problems within the African American community that just stem from slavery. They stem from Jim Crow. And those things are not as far away as people make it seem. It was a few decades ago. And slavery lasted for most of American history. So the way we function as a society hasn't completely eradicated those problems. Just because we had a black president doesn't mean we're really that forward. I mean, look at the president we have right afterwards. But anyway, enough about politics. I'm trying to talk about my research here. The more research that I want to do after this is my other conclusion, is that there's also human trafficking, which is a huge problem when you talk about slavery. That is another form of slavery that I did not touch on here because I wanted to focus more on African Americans and also cheap labor that we profit on directly. But human trafficking is a huge problem, and I do want to address that further because it's not only a slavery issue, it's also a women's rights issue, because there's a lot of human trafficking when it comes to women for the sex industry. And then there's also problems with human trafficking when it comes to child pornography. It's a deep, dark hole that I was not going to touch, even though I actually fumbled through it a little bit when going through all of this. So, yeah, we have here a nice little reference to all of the places that I got my information from. And yeah, here's my little feudalism chart as I showed before. And my last little image is, I think that's a little self-explanatory. I hope you liked my presentation. I took much longer than I expected, but this is how Western civilization and slavery are connected.